professor at St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. He has a very long and very illustrious curriculum vitae. So what I'll do, Faisal, is I'll just say it in brief. As far as his education goes, he completed his BA double honors at the Department of Anthropology and History, and his MA in the Department of History at University of Chicago. He's had several appointments so far. He's been visiting lecturer at the Department of History, University of Chicago, a Singh visiting lecturer in the Department of History at Yale University, assistant professor of history at the New School twice, and inaugural chair in Gandhi studies at the Mahatma Gandhi University in Kottayam. I'm also very happy to inform everyone that he's an honorary fellow of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. Professor Faizi has published several monographs. I will read the titles of some of them. Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality, Modernity, Cornell, 2005. The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militant Islam and Global Politics, Columbia, 2008. The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence, Harvard, 2012. And more recently, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, in Harvard, 2013. He has written several chapters in edited books. He has also edited several books. And I once again warmly welcome you, Faisal. This is, of course, on a virtual platform, but we look forward to seeing you in Mumbai, at the earliest. And it is my pleasure now to invite you to give the talk on Gandhi's silence on the occasion of Republic Day, and also as we celebrate 75 years of India's independence. So over to you, Faisal.
Thank you very much, Manjari, and to Shahnaz, you both for inviting me to speak, and to the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, of which I'm honored to be an honorary member, and a happy Republic Day to you all. It really is a privilege to speak on such an occasion about the father of the nation. And let me get right into my talk. So as I'm sure you know, democracy tends to be linked with voice, speech, and communication. It's very difficult for us to think of democratic practice and democratic governance without speech and voice, because this is what democracy is meant to allow. It's meant to allow the collective and individual voicing of opinion. And that opinion then becomes instrumental in the making of policy. In contrast, or by way of contrast, tyranny or despotism tends to be defined by silence and obedience. People are too afraid to speak. There is no voice, there is only obedience. Or there's a very secretive communication. So nothing in public, purely obedience. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that despite these sort of stereotyped ways of understanding the role of voice, speech, and communication in democracy as opposed to in despotism or tyranny, what I'd like to say is that silence actually also lies at the heart of democracy in some ways. And one of these ways, of course, one of the ways in which silence is central to democracy is clear in the practice of the secret ballot. So when you go to vote, you're meant to do so secretly. No one's meant to know or what party you're voted for, and your vote, the most sacred ritual of, as it were, democratic practice, is conducted alone, individually, and in silence. And here, of course, we know that such silence and such secrecy even is meant to guarantee the voter's anonymity and therefore freedom from external influence. So, once you're in that voting booth, you can throw off any pressure, any outside pressure, any external influence, and cast your vote according to your own conscience in complete freedom. So the figure of the secret ballot, or the practice of the secret ballot, is really interesting because it seems to contradict the association of democracy with voice and speech and freedom of speech, in fact. In the secret ballot, which lies, as I said, at the heart of democracy, freedom is silent, and it must be silent. It must be silent not simply to protect the voter from outside pressure, but also because the electoral majority that is meant to be produced out of a whole range of such silent and therefore free votes is supposed to be coincidental in character. And this is, sort of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's contribution, if you will, one of his contributions to the theory of democracy, that the electoral majority that is created through these individual votes is meant to be coincidental in character, because it's the various individuals who cast their votes are meant to do so individually and not, as it were, collectively. The collectivity is produced after the silent casting of votes and the secret casting of votes, to produce a majority that is not a given majority. So people might have voted for a particular candidate or a particular party for many different reasons, for all kinds of reasons. They hadn't agreed previously to do so for any particular reason. And it is the coincidental coming together of all these different motivations that makes a majority, a democratic majority. So the point Rousseau is making is that a democratic or electoral majority is not the same as a social majority. It cannot be the same as a social majority, because if a social majority defined by class or culture or language or religion or ethnicity or many other variables are possible, if a social majority is meant to translate itself into a political majority, then of course voting would be pointless. Then you would have no reason for, as it were, competitive practice of democratic electioneering, because the social majority would automatically become a political majority. But this is precisely what the secret ballot and individual voting is meant to negate, right? So it may be that a social majority is reinforced by an electoral or political majority, but the importance of the secret ballot resides precisely in its silence, in its individuality, and in the freedom that is linked to these two factors. So what is produced, the majority that is produced in an election, is a general will, rather than the will of all. Right? It's a general will because it has been produced out of often disparate and incommensurable reasons made by individuals, and not simply as a translation of a social or a given identity. Now, the problem of democracy, or one of its problems, that tends to negate this element of silence and freedom coming together in the secret ballot, among other things, is the fact that there is a propensity in campaigning and electioneering and in political debate of destroying the autonomy of the voting subject by rehearsed speech. Right? So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that political parties, for instance, all over the world put out, as they should, slogans and set out their platforms, so you know what it is that you're voting for. And this, of course, is absolutely crucial. It's required. But when they do such things, what often happens is that the reasoning given for you to vote for any particular party ends up being prefabricated. So it becomes a form of what I'm calling of rehearsed speech. So rather than thinking yourself of what you should do and why you should do it, you are meant to go along with a prefabricated argument, and you don't necessarily, or the voter doesn't necessarily inquire into its reality or otherwise, despite the fact that the multiplicity of political parties making separate claims are meant to subject these forms of rehearsed speech to inquiry and contestation. But if everyone has their form of rehearsed speech, then what you have is the competition of various kinds of prefabricated narratives, which tends to diminish the individual's freedom. And it is that freedom, of course, that is supposed to express itself in the voting booth silently through the secret ballot. And it is in part because Gandhi was highly suspicious of this kind of rehearsed speech, because he thought it shut down debate rather than producing it, that it railroaded all political discussion only down certain paths. And it did so by detracting from the individual voter's freedom. Right? So it's the dominance and propensity of rehearsed speech, of prefabricated arguments, which are often not true. And Gandhi, in his book Hind Swaraj of 1909, when he analyzes democracy, British democracy in Westminster, he criticizes, severely criticizes the party system, the system of political parties and parliament, precisely for this reason, because he thinks whether it's political parties, whether it's newspapers that follow particular political parties, what they end up doing is putting out a narrative which is so powerful because it is made by certain kinds of vested interests in the press, in parliament, that it ends up often flattening, if not negating, individual reasoning, and therefore the freedom of conscience that lies at the heart, or should lie at the heart, of democracy. So what Gandhi was interested in is the cultivation of silence, not just in the voting booth, but in general outside. And we know that Gandhi experimented with silence throughout his life and his career. And one of these examples, of course, is his famous weekly day of silence. Now, that day of silence didn't mean that he wasn't communicating with people, because he would write notes and read notes, but he refused to speak. And in refusing to speak, I think what he was doing was showing that the very factor of voice and speech, which we take correctly to be central to democracy and to its politics, is also something that we need to view with some suspicion, because of the dangers of what I'm calling rehearsed speech or prefabricated narrative. Right? And the danger of these kinds of narratives, of course, result from the fact not only that the individual's freedom is negated in the process, but that they often tend to mirror the very social majorities that are meant to be kept aside from the democratic process. So they can exist as social majorities, but they shouldn't simply translate themselves into political majorities, because that would, of course, mean democracy is a pointless exercise. If a social majority is always a political majority, that means that the minority never gets a chance, whatever kind of minority it is, right? So this is crucial. Now, an important threat to the autonomy and the freedom of the individual voter or the individual Democrat was, in Gandhi's view, the mediation of the liberal state or the democratic state itself, which creates these kinds of prefabricated narratives that I was describing and rehearsed speech. Now, how does it do it? In actually good democratic fashion. So again, in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi takes on this problem. What he realizes is that the colonial state, in this sense, is not, I as he might put it, evil because, or simply because it is colonial, but because it is in fact liberal. How is it liberal? It is liberal because it sets itself up as a neutral third party there to mediate between its subjects, right? So if subjects or citizens have differences with each other, these differences are meant to be mediated by and through the state. And that's how liberal states tend to work. Gandhi is very critical of this. He's critical of it because he thinks this form of mediation disallows the subjects or the citizens themselves from coming to any direct relationship with one another. They must go through the state. And in doing so, they are reshaped and they are turned into political interests of a certain kind, right? So, for instance, the example he gives, whether it's castes, upper castes and lower castes, whether it's religions, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, etc., when they are mediated as interests by the state, they become political interests, right? So if there is a problem, the state then must come to some kind of arrangement between, as it were, rival parties, and these parties never meet themselves directly, never end up having a direct relationship with each other, because that relationship must be triangulated by the state, and it can only be triangulated by the state once these groups end up as interest groups. Interest groups defined by the kinds of prefabricated narratives I was describing earlier, right? So let me give you two examples that Gandhi himself gives in Hind Swaraj. So one has to do with doctors and the other with lawyers, and you may well be familiar with this quite famous passage from Hind Swaraj. What does Gandhi say about doctors and mediation? So these examples are not directly related to elections and voting, but in fact, they speak about the same issue, which is to say mediation and its dangers, right? So here is the example of doctors. Gandhi says, an ordinary Indian overeats, has indigestion, feels terrible, goes to the doctor gives him or her a tablet. That person takes this medicine, feels much better, and in doing so becomes subject to the mediating mechanisms of the colonial state. How? Because the patient now feels free to eat and overeat whenever they want, because they know that this medicine exists, which they can take. Now, in doing so, they have lost control over their own body, right? They have lost, as it were, self-control and freedom in that sense. They have become dependent on a pharmaceutical product, which links them to a whole system of capitalist production and pharmaceutical companies, all of which, along with the doctor, are accredited by the state and therefore mediated by it. All right. So it's an interesting example because it shows you how a very everyday action, and Gandhi constantly deals with everyday actions, ends up with, in this case, the patient losing control over their own self and becoming dependent upon, if you will, the state validated set of practices and pharmaceutical products. And if you lose control over your own body, you cannot really be seen as a free individual, right? With lawyers, you have a similar logic. Here is Gandhi's example. Two people quarrel. Instead of addressing their differences by informal mediation or by directly confronting each other, they go to the courts, and the courts, of course, are instruments of the state. They are among the instruments that the state uses to mediate precisely relations between subjects or citizens. And when they go to court, they have to go to lawyers, and lawyers, of course, are not interested in resolving the problem. They are interested, in Gandhi's view, himself being a lawyer, in spinning out the problem and making money out of it, and not getting people to reconcile, but getting the state in the form of the judge and the jury to pronounce a verdict in which one person is declared guilty and the other innocent. Now, what this verdict does is it disallows those two individuals or those two parties to a case from ever coming together again. They will never reconcile. So what it does is perpetuate difference, it perpetuates enmity. And it does so through the state's mediation, because it's the power of the state that forces, as it were, the issue. But that forcing of the issue really prevents social harmony. It prevents any agreement. So the state, through its powers of mediation, ends up getting more and more powerful, becoming more and more powerful, because it relies upon the division of its own subjects or citizens, right? And one name for this division is, in fact, the famous phrase divide and rule, right, which Gandhi used. And it describes the colonial, but also in this sense, the liberal state, as one that relied upon a policy of divide and rule, not intentionally, but structurally. It happens in the very process of liberal mediation. Now you see that in the case both of doctors and of lawyers, the state's mediation ends up creating certain kinds of narratives of guilt and innocence, of rivalry, of dependence and independence, and robs the individuals or the citizens themselves of their own self-control. They're given over into the power of the state. So I think I've labored this point enough, and I hope it's clear why it might be that these forms of mediation are problematic, and they rob individuals of the freedom that is necessary to make democracy possible. So what does Gandhi do? He recommends instead unmediated relations, direct relations between, in his case, Indians, right? And his various satyagrahas are meant to do precisely this, because they ignore the state. They ignore the state, in this case, the colonial state. And what they try to do is create relations of, if you will, moral relations through nonviolence. And nonviolence is meant to persuade the enemy, to persuade the other, to open a space for agreement. It's not meant to end up in, as it were, victory as opposed to defeat, where one side is victorious and the other side is defeated. It's meant to result in not a divide and rule strategy of dividing people one from the other, but of knitting them together again, right? That's what satyagraha is meant to do, and that is what nonviolence is meant to do. So he thinks that when you get rid of the mediation of the state, which he has exemplified in the figure of doctors and lawyers, what you end up with is a kind of interesting relationship that has no mediation. Right? People are forced to come to terms with each other, even in ways that they don't like. Now, how does he do this? I'm going to give you two examples, which Gandhi takes from everyday life in his own time, but these are examples that are actually commonplace even today in India. So what Gandhi's method always entailed was not coming out with a purely theoretical response to the kinds of problems I've raised, but rather thinking them through in actual issues, conflicts, and practices. Right. So the two that I want to focus on here very briefly are disputes over conversion from one religion to another, and disputes over cow protection or cow slaughter. So conversion or proselytism had become important and controversial in Gandhi's day. He thought precisely because of the logic of liberal mediation that I have just been describing. And how was this the case? Well, it was in part the case because the franchise, which was being broadened in this period through the 20th century, that is to say, who could vote and for what, resulted in a kind of competition amongst various Indian groups to augment their numbers, especially in a situation where you had separate electorates, where Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs in some places, were voting separately for their own candidates. So what you had to do was to build precisely the kind of social majorities that I described earlier, by augmenting your numbers, by trying to claim more and more people as being part of your community, even though in the past you may not have considered them part of your community. So you're constantly trying to build up your numbers. And it is in this context that conversion of people from one religion to the other becomes so sensitive and becomes so problematic, right? Because of this logic of representation and mediation that plays into elections and the making of the rehearsed speech that I described. Now, Gandhi is not a fan of conversion, but he doesn't want to ban it altogether either. What does he do? He tries to, as it were, take the hot air out of the issue by suggesting that the problem with this issue was precisely the rehearsed speech that defined it. That is to say, whether you were trying to proselytize among people of another religion or convert people to your religion, or whether you yourself wanted to convert from your religion to another religion, or whether you were opposing the conversion of members of your community to someone else's religion. In all these cases, all the people involved in the dispute or the debate, it is speech that is crucial, right? So that those who want to convert others might resort to insulting the religion of others. They might resort to falsehoods about other religions, and similarly is the case with those who don't want to allow or to permit proselytism. So on all sides of this debate, what you have is a whole lot of rehearsed speech, which is often violent speech, and that really doesn't allow for any kind of non-violent direct relationship. And what Gandhi says is that words and language always betray the very religion that they are meant to support. They end up making it, as it were, look much worse than it really is. Whoever you are, whether you're trying to convert someone or want to convert yourself, or whether you're trying to prevent such a conversion. And what he does then is to advise silence on all sides and allow those who are interested in religion to make the lived example of religious people count, right? So he tells missionaries, for instance, that instead of engaging in polemics, trying to attract people to your religion, what you should do is perform seva, perform services to society, which you all already do, and live by your own faith. And you should become the best examples of the faith you claim to be representing. And in that way, you will attract followers, whether they will convert or not is neither here nor there, by the force of your example, not the treacherous violence of your language, which always betrays the example. Right? And he says that this actually allows for truth to shine forth. It allows truth to shine forth because language has been taken out of the equation. The silence of example can attract people to the religion of the person offering that example, not simply to convert to it, but perhaps to admire it, perhaps to copy what is exemplary about that kind of practice in their own faith. So it allows for a multiplicity of responses. And in doing so, it creates a direct relationship between people belonging to different faiths from which violence has been abstracted. And it does so precisely by getting rid of the rehearsed speech and the prefabricated argument and the violence that go along with them, and therefore allowing the subject's autonomy and freedom. The freedom both, if you will, of the missionary as well as of either the potential convert or in any case, the person of another religion who views such an example. In this way, people can learn from one another, Gandhi suggests. So this is one case through which Gandhi thinks about the virtue and the value of silence, right? One highly contested case. He says very often in the debate over proselytism that he uses this example: the rose doesn't need to be heard. It cannot be heard. Obviously, it's silent. That the fragrance of a rose depends upon silence, and in doing so, it's a quite nice example, I think. He shifts from sound and sight, which are the media of speech, either speech that is heard or speech that is read in pamphlets and newspapers, to fragrance. Right? He switches from these two senses, from hearing and sight, to fragrance, to smell, which he thinks allows for unmediated relations in which truth is not drowned out by arguments on all sides, in which freedom becomes possible, freedom of choice, freedom through example, right? And it allows for multiple consequences, not just one. So unlike the prose and the speech of proselytism, where you're asked to convert to something, the silent example allows for many more results. It allows for learning, it allows for instruction, it allows for influence, in addition to proselytism. Right? Now, by repudiating language, however, what Gandhi has done is also repudiated one of the classical definitions of humanity itself. Right? The human being, often seen from classical times as a speaking being or a reasoning being, right? That speech is meant to be traditionally one of the fundamental ways of defining humanity or human relations. But that is not the only one. Of course, there are others, speech and reasoning being one, but others include commensality, eating together, sexual relations, reproduction, and speech, of course, encompasses all of these, because with speech, what you have is communication, and with communication, what you have is ostensibly living together. And with living together, you have all of these other things: reproduction, sexual relations, commensality, etc., etc. All of the things that make a human society possible. Now, by rejecting speech or language, Gandhi is also putting all these other things that depend upon language into question. And he's doing so deliberately and in a very, very interesting way, because what he would like to do is actually open up the realm of moral relations to the non-human. Right? And this is where the issue or the dispute around car protection comes in. So what is Gandhi arguing? On the one hand, he argues that the definition of humanity in terms of language and all it entails is not entirely accurate, because of course we tend to think of speech as bringing people together, but as we have just seen, I hope, through the examples I have preferred from Gandhi, speech can just as well drive them apart, right? So speech and language and voice are as likely to divide people as to bring them together. Similarly, commensal relations, sexual relations, all of these other things that define communities may bring them together, but it may also tear them apart, because we know, and Gandhi tells us, that often the most intimate relations between men and women, between parents and children, between lovers, between, the most intimate relations, which you take to be at the foundation of all our social relations, tend to be the most violent relations. That violence can be at the very heart of what is most intimate. And of course, Gandhi, as a thinker of nonviolence, questions this. So he also argues that the way in which we conceptualize social or human relations through language, through sexuality, through commensality, etc., these are all ways in which racists also define their communities. All right. So a racist community will also be one, or a communal, or whatever kind of community or ideology you would like to identify, which depends upon excluding others. All of these kinds of exclusive communities want to privilege the use of communication, language, sexual employment, eating, etc., all these relations only amongst a particular group of people and not with other group of people. So for Gandhi, any kind of definition of collective relations, social relations, which can characterize, say, racists as well as humanitarians, is highly problematic. So he's critical not simply of language because he thinks that language can give rise to violence, but he's critical of all of these other forms of relationship that we normally think about as being so definitive of harmonious human relations. Now, obviously, Gandhi's not denying them. He's not saying people should never talk to each other or should never have any other kinds of relations with each other. What he's saying is that we must be careful when taking these relations as the foundation of our societies, because these kinds of definitions are as characteristic of exclusive and violent identities as they are of inclusive and nonviolent ones, right? But he's more concerned by opening up this set of relations to the non-human, because he understands that in addition to our most intimate relations often being also the most violent ones, men and women, children and parents, etc., also violent are the relations between the human and the non-human worlds, right? So when we privileged human relations, we often do so against non-human beings, living things. So it's that division of violence too that Gandhi is interested in. And this is how he comes to address cow protection, which, as you know, was then, as to some degree it is now, the site of huge violence and disputation. Now, I won't go into its history, which I'm sure you know about, but just as he approaches the problem of conversion or proselytism, as it were, from an angle by redefining it, so too he does with cow protection. And what he does there is basically privilege the relationship of human and non-human as offering, if you will, a better model for social relations than the kinds of relationships I was describing just now, which depend upon language, voice, communication, etc., and all the other relations that those make possible. How is this? It is precisely, he says, because we do not, as human beings, share a language with animals, not just cows, any animals, that we often end up entering into relations of violence with them. But what we should do, he suggests, is see precisely the lack of language between human and animal as being exemplary and a model. So the thing about cow protection that catches his fancy is that it creates a relationship between human beings and non-human beings that is not dependent upon language, for which mutual communication is in fact impossible, because you cannot possibly tell, you cannot speak to the cow, or the cow cannot speak to you, and not just the cow, any other non-human being. So from this relationship, he wants to take the possibility of non-violence that does not depend upon language, voice, and all of these other things that I've been describing. And if the relationship between human and non-human, unmediated by language, can become a model of non-violence, because you don't have to understand the animal. Your duty towards the animal is not based upon being like the animal, is not based upon communication with the animal, is not based upon any of those things. That, Gandhi thinks, is a worthwhile model to consider human relations as well. You don't need to speak the same language. You don't even need to understand your fellow human beings to have a duty towards them, a duty of nonviolence. And therefore, killing in the name of cow protection is, of course, contradictory for Gandhi, precisely because the relationship of human and non-human in cow protection is premised upon nonviolence. So how can violence come out of it? So here you have also a way of redefining the problem, as you see, just as with conversion. Now, for Gandhi, therefore, the relationship between human and non-human allows him to think about relations without language, relations mediated not by language, but defined by silence, and how silence in this case ends up becoming the site of nonviolence, rather than liberal reciprocity through communication or contract, of all of those things that we think about when we think about communication, language, and voice. Now, Gandhi is concerned, not just moving on here, Gandhi is concerned not only with the kind of rehearsed speech and prefabricated arguments, the noise, the violent noise, the violence of language that overwhelms the moral subject from the outside, which is what I've been describing so far, right? So the furious debate over cow protection, the furious debate over proselytism, furious debates over party politics, you know, in all of these kinds of debates, language is weaponized and is used to create certain kinds of collective subjects in a way that diminishes, if not demolishes, the autonomy of the individual. And that's what I've been dealing with so far. But Gandhi is concerned not only with language used in this way from the outside, but also concerned with the uncontrolled thoughts and fantasies and violence of the individual, him or herself, that exists from the inside, or inside each person, inside each one of us, right? So just as the individual's inner freedom is meant to be protected from this rehearsed language and prefabricated speech that comes from the outside, so too must the outside world be protected from our own inner violence, our uncontrolled thoughts and fantasies, which might play themselves out violently outside. And his days of silence represent this dual form of protection, right? So when you're silent, what you're doing is you're refusing to, as it were, accept the language or participate in the violent speech that comes from the outside. You're keeping yourself safe. But what you're also doing is you're stopping yourself from releasing, if you will, violent speech to the outside, even if that violent speech is just the result of your own uncontrolled fantasies and desires. So silence is meant to work, as it were, in both ways, from the outside in and from the inside out. And that, I argue, is what his days of silence are meant to exemplify. So you're protecting the self but you're also protecting the world. Right? And in this way, what happens is that silence for Gandhi makes truth visible, that language actually prevents you from seeing that truth. So just as the exemplary activity of the missionary, for instance, or of the religious person displays their faith and the virtues of their faith, and each faith has its virtues, in a much better way than any speech can, because there is no hypocritical distance between speech and action. If all you have is action, silent action, so too your own silence is capable of making the truth visible, the truth that is obscured by violent and furious language. And one of the ways Gandhi does this, or tries to make this truth visible, is by, quite apart from being silent, is by literally emptying out the inner self, right? Through living almost transparently. And I'm sure you know how he does this. He lives in the gaze of the world. He lives, he writes publicly about what even today you would think of as the most deeply intimate and shameful and embarrassing episodes of his life. He willingly confesses them. He dresses in a very minimalistic, let's say, manner. He lives his life in front of others. And this is a way of, as it were, making himself transparent. So silence and visibility in this sense go together. What his transparency does is constantly offer his own body and his bodily practice as proof of his ideas. So he certainly voices his ideas, but those ideas are meant to be seen in action. And it's the action that is crucial here. That's more important than the ideas themselves. And he does so in very many interesting ways, often by disavowing his own motivations. Because, of course, the thing about silence is, once you have criticized communication and voice, and once you have suggested that the relationship between the human and the non-human is defined by non-communication and indeed by ignorance, what you have said is that non-violent relations are possible without knowledge, and that they should be possible without knowledge. You cannot possibly know everything about the other, and it is because you don't know everything about the other that you end up imputing motives to that person or those people out of ignorance, because you're afraid, you're uncertain, you don't know. What Gandhi does is say, ignorance in this case is not a bad thing. And the silence is also, as it were, a manifestation of the not knowing, of the ignorance. Right? You cannot speak to the cow. You cannot know what the non-human being is thinking, if anything. But that should be the very basis of your non-violent relations with it, just as it should with other people. Because you cannot possibly know what everyone else is thinking, nor should you be able to know. What you can know is what they do if they live, as it were, in the sight of others. And their example, just as the example of the missionary living his or her faith, is meant to produce a multiplicity of responses. They broaden out the number of non-violent responses possible, as opposed to simply one. Right? And now silence, and therefore not knowing and ignorance, for Gandhi are crucial, because of course these indeed are human qualities. Full communication, full knowledge, lack of ignorance would make you God. And for Gandhi, it is precisely what is unknown, what is uncertain, what comes to you from the future, what is surprising, that is God, right? This is what, this is where he sees divine action occurring. And he claims not even to know very often in his autobiography, for instance, what his own wife Kasturba is thinking. So it's the shift from silence to not knowing is really, really important here, and I can go into that later. Truth, because it cannot be fully known, makes for, if you will, allows Gandhi to think about the moral virtue of radical ignorance. How do you act morally without knowledge of others, or indeed even without often knowledge of yourself? You cannot know not just everything about others, but you cannot even, he thinks, know everything about yourself. There's something about all of us that we ourselves don't know, but that might be visible to others, right? And there are many ways in which these apparently paradoxical and strange ideas can go, but let me end by suggesting how it is that Gandhi, by bringing all of these issues up, ends up conceptualizing what unmediated relations should look like. If you cannot know the truth of all others, and if you cannot know even your own truth, if silence sometimes or very often delivers more in the way of nonviolence than speech does, if speech conceals more than it reveals, then it is not language that binds people together nonviolently, but in fact, silence. What Gandhi says one should do is to ignore the inner motivations of others and of all of our interlocutors. You know, a lot of violence and the language that is violent language is premised upon guessing at what the sinister, apparently sinister motivations of others are like. You know, because you don't know what they think, you impute the worst to them, right? And what Gandhi says is, of course, you cannot know what they think, but in a way that is neither here nor there. What you must do is simply judge them by their acts, without the intervention of language, even without language, just as our relations with non-human beings are performed through action and without language. And this results in a society or a set of social relations in which there is, as it were, a competition of truthfulness, right? So for instance, the missionary or anyone else might say, this is my truth, this is what I think, and you might say something else. Those two statements, instead of being mediated by a neutral third party like a court of law or the state or whatever, need to be put in a direct relationship with one another, but a relationship which is not mediated by language. It's a relationship, if you will, of silence, or rather, it is a relationship in which silent practices are what allow us to see the truth of people and not what it is that they're actually saying. So if you will, Gandhi's idea of democracy is premised upon a competition of truths or a competition in truth, where everyone is trying to show to themselves as well as to their neighbors, to others, that they are in fact faithful to what they hold to be their truth. So rather than persuading others of your truth, what you must do is live up to what you yourself say is your truth. And you shall be tested on that. And so you end up with a set of social relations in which people's lives are, as it were, displayed for others, and strangely not mediated by language. So we have gone very far from the secret ballot with which I began, but I hope you can see how Gandhi's understanding of violent speech and the non-violent virtue of silence can actually take us back to that original point of democratic practice, which places silence at the very heart of the political process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Devji, for that presentation. And now I think we can invite questions from the audience. So there are some questions in the chat box, and I think since you have a panel to attend to, so do we have half an hour, Faisal, for observations, question, answer? Is that fine? You are muted.
Sorry, yes, I think we have about 25 minutes.
Okay.
That's all right.
So there's a question from Professor Vispi Balaporia, the president of the Asiatic Society. She's written, in India, does religion limit the individual's independence in deciding her vote as an individual?
Well, that of course is precisely the right question to ask, because this is the kind of thing that Gandhi is dealing with, right? In Gandhi's day, as to some degree in our own, what you have is the effort to make social identities into political identities, whether they are majority or minority identities. And this, of course, as I was suggesting, ends up repudiating the work of democracy itself, which is not meant to simply reflect a social majority. It is meant to take apart a social majority and recreate out of it a majority made up, as it were, coincidentally, out of choices that come from many different directions. In Gandhi's day, as in our own, the effort to turn a social majority into a political majority are threatening for any form of democratic practice. And it is precisely that possibility that his views on silence are meant to address. How do you try to, how can one, as it were, move away from that threatening possibility? Now, Gandhi, of course, is not so interested in democratic practice as such. As I said, in Hind Swaraj, he criticizes Parliament and parliamentary democracy itself. So he doesn't really engage in institutional reasoning about, how it is that we should run parliament or how it is that voters should behave. What he instead is interested in is how do we create or remake social relations such that they privilege non-violence. And once you remake social relations in this way, then your, as it were, institutional relations such as voting and participating in political life will automatically be transformed. So he doesn't get into the institutional arrangements, but thinks that his understanding of nonviolence, insofar as it transforms our social relations, will end up transforming the political ones as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a question by Sinjan Jha in the chat box, and the question is, how can one escape this state of dependence, given that in the status quo groups follow rigid beliefs? They follow rigid beliefs. For instance, the question says, in the case of land disputes such as the Ram Mandir, so what would your take be on it?
Yeah, so there again, it's I take these cases as being exemplary of the kind of thing Gandhi was critical of, right? The manufacturing of rehearsed speech and prefabricated arguments. It happens all the time everywhere. This is not simply true of India. But in India, you see the violent possibilities perhaps more clearly than in some other places. Now, in some ways, precisely because these forms of prefabricated speech and rehearsed speech play into democratic practice, it's actually quite difficult to deal with them because how should I put it? Because they themselves are part of democratic practice. They're not undemocratic, and they're not illegitimate in all cases. But it's precisely the democratic element that actually gives rise to the violence in some ways. And here too, what Gandhi says about Westminster-style democracy holds. The role of political parties, the role of the press and the media in manufacturing certain kinds of narratives that prevent individual thinking are what he thinks of as being highly problematic and prone to violence. So again, to repeat myself, what he ends up doing is shifting away from the institutional world to social relations and trying to remake those. But we are probably bound to think about what to do in the institutional world as well. Because of course, Gandhi is speaking and writing at a time when democracy is not available in India or not available in any fulsome way. It's highly limited and restricted in colonial times. There is no easy solution to this except to think about ways of remaking social relations outside political parties and platforms and elections, while at the same time trying to privilege the freedom of the individual in institutional processes. Because the problem often of addressing these kinds of rehearsed speech, forms of rehearsed speech or prefabricated argumentation, is that we often tend to criticize them in such a way as to impugn or put democracy itself and democratic itself at risk. And that is, of course, exactly not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is precisely focusing on the individual conscience of the voter and of the freedom of the individual, that freedom is dependent upon not being beholden to social majorities of any kind. So that is, I'm afraid, no answer as such, except it might provide a principle for addressing these kinds of issues, both socially in terms of our everyday social relations and politically, the importance of the individual rather than the collective in democratic decision making.
Okay. Madhav Nair has a question. He says, thank you for highlighting the implications of Gandhi's silence for democracy. But he asks, can we also read into this silence a critique of history?
Yes, that's actually fascinating because, of course, he does have a critique of history. He thinks that, for instance, well, he thinks, first of all, that historical narratives he understands underlie colonial justifications for empire. And they do so in the following way, by saying, for instance, that colonized peoples are not yet civilized enough to rule themselves, and therefore colonizing peoples are there, as it were, in an educative capacity, to safeguard and to develop supposedly underdeveloped or undeveloped civilizations until they gain the sufficient maturity to govern themselves. This kind of justification is based entirely on history, on historical narratives. So he dislikes it partly on that basis. He also dislikes history because he thinks that history in the way we think about it, tends to be a history of violence. That when we write about history, we are writing about violence and about violent actions. And that when we try to include non-violent actions into history, we inadvertently end up making them like violent actions as well. That history tends to be a history of battles and fights and things like that, which is why he suggests that non-violence has no history. Really interesting suggestion on Gandhi's part. Only violence has a history, partly because only violence is a positive factor, right? Non-violence, as Gandhi repeatedly said, is a negative factor insofar as even grammatically it is negative, both in English, non-violence, and in Sanskrit, ahimsa. It is something that does not exist as a positive form. Violence exists as a positive form. Non-violence is named after violence. It doesn't have its own name. It's not called peace. It's not called harmony. It's not called any of those things. It is precisely called non-violence. It takes its name after something positive, but it negates that positivity. So in this sense, too, non-violence cannot have a history. And so I think I want to thank Dr. Nair because he's quite right that if non-violence cannot have a history, not being a positive category, it is necessarily silent because history is a history of voice, so it tends to be a history of voice. So yes, the two are definitely connected. It hadn't occurred to me, but thank you very much for your question.
Connected with that, there's a question from Renu Parikh, which says, can you compare or draw any analogy between Gandhi's silence with Buddha's silent sermons?
That another very interesting question. I don't know enough about Buddha's silent sermons of silence, but what I will say, of course, is that silence has been for a long time the preferred practice of, if you will, ascetic or religious dispensations, that it is a form of discipline, as indeed it was for Gandhi. You need to discipline yourself, and you need to discipline your own thoughts and your own fantasies and your own desires. And silence, in his case, a day of silence, of complete silence. But silence, in another sense, is of course an everyday act. Silence in the sense of abstention from lying, abstention from violent speech, abstention from incitement, so that kind of silence, again, cannot be seen because you're just abstaining from doing something. It's literally invisible. Whereas the complete silence of Gandhi's day of silence is visible insofar as you can tell that someone is not speaking or refusing to speak. So there are at least two kinds of silence possible here. And as I was suggesting, silence is a way to discipline your own self, but also for your own self to secure your inner freedom, but also to protect the outside world from your unregulated and unrestrained desires, fantasies, violent thoughts, etc. Right? So it works in this double way, and there, I'm sure, is a lot to be said about the meaningfulness of silence in early modern, medieval, and ancient Indian thought, about which I'm not qualified to speak.
Right. Thanks. Ravinder Singh says silence also as an instrument to silence the opposition. So here the question is, did Gandhi's fasts involve a vow of silence? As in, was it an instrument, to silence the opposition?
Well, of course, Gandhi was often accused in his own day of using his fasts as blackmail. That he would actually force people, the opposition in this case, to capitulate by putting his own body at risk. It's difficult to know, of course, whether it's difficult either to approve or to repudiate this kind of argument because we simply don't have the materials for it. But I would like to suggest that a blackmail by putting yourself at risk is a kind of peculiar way of silencing the opposition, and one that, if you will, Gandhi would not perhaps have seen as being in itself an evil act. As long as you're putting yourself at risk, that was crucial for Gandhi, and that was, of course, what was important about satyagraha, about nonviolence, that you're putting yourself at risk. You're not putting someone else at risk. Your self-suffering is what should allow for the conversion of your enemy, because your self-suffering is not directed against your enemy in a violent way. It's always open. It acts as an invitation to, ironically, in this case, to speech, to negotiation. Right? Now, you might think that that speech is coerced. And indeed, when you think about Gandhi's famous fast over the Pune Pact against, as it were, Ambedkar, he said it was not against Ambedkar. He said it was against, as it were, Orthodox Hinduism, who were practicing caste discrimination. But Ambedkar saw this as being Gandhi's coercion, that Gandhi put his own body at risk. He risked death in order to force Ambedkar to the negotiating table, out of which, of course, we end up with this whole system of reservations, which ends up becoming part of the constitution. And who is it but Ambedkar himself who puts them in the constitution? So this is the true irony, if you will, of this matter, that Ambedkar, who always thought, perhaps correctly, that he had been coerced into negotiating with Gandhi, nevertheless did negotiate with him. And even after Gandhi's death, ended up instantiating or instituting this form of reservations in the constitution. So he ends up owning the very thing which he felt he was forced into. So there are a set of paradoxical issues that come up in these kinds of things. I would suggest that Gandhi's silence, he doesn't silence the opposition insofar as he silences himself, and in doing so, he allows, as it were, his opposition to speak. The fact that those who opposed him felt that in some cases that they were coerced into what they did does not negate the opportunity they had always had to speak. And in this sense, it is, if you will, the silence is entirely on Gandhi's part. And what his silence shows is that it is speech, the opponent's speech, that has ended up losing power in comparison. So I would perhaps stop there for this question, while leaving it somewhat uncertain, because I cannot, as I started out by saying, be entirely sure whether Gandhi did or did not operate in a coercive way.
Okay. Right. Sinchan Jha says, Professor, as you mentioned, how Gandhi provided a narrative of live by your own faith and do services in the context of religious practices.
भाई इसको बोलना बंद कर।
Could we, can you please mute yourselves, because we're not able. Sorry, Faisal, there was a bit of disturbance. So you live by your own faith and do services in context of religious practices. How can the modern society ensure that these services, these services work in compliance with the utilitarian well-being, rather than simply justifying one's acts on the grounds of dharma? That's the question.
Yeah, what I think what's really interesting about Gandhi is that this has often been grounds for criticizing him, that he seems to have lent himself to debates and to movements which often people think are not right, such as movements to ban proselytism or movements to ban cow slaughter. Now, what I find admirable, one of the things I find admirable about Gandhi is he takes all such things very seriously. It's almost like in an almost deliberately naive way. But that was his, that's how he behaved in general. Instead of, if someone came to him and said, oh, we should disallow religious conversion or we should stop cow slaughter, instead of simply saying yes or no, or trying to suspect the sinister, true, apparently motives behind such questions, what Gandhi did is almost naively take them on board. And he did so in part because he did that with everyone, right? Whatever the subject was, he in a Socratic way almost, he entertains it and he remakes and reinterprets it. So he understands that even though a great many of the arguments and the practices that come out of movements against proselytism or against cow slaughter might be disingenuous and are in fact very violent, in fact he says so very often, he also understands that that's not all that is part of these movements, that there might actually be something else going on in those movements that can be rescued. That the very violence of these movements might depend upon something that is not violent in its own right. How do you rescue the non-violent core, the non-violent kernel, even from within a movement that is ostensibly so violent? And that is what he tries to do. He takes religion as everything else very seriously. And he's not simply going to do a yes-no response or condemn someone as being completely out of line and therefore, not worth dealing with. He deals with everyone. And he deals with them in this way. How do you recognize something, the core, the kernel that is non-violent in this dispute, in this debate, and how do you rescue it? And how do you remake it so that the non-violence that he thinks lies at the heart of cow protection becomes the non-violence that should characterize all our social relations? Rather than saying, no, we can't have this at all. And this takes courage and it takes principle. And this, I think, is what he does. He's been condemned, in my view, somewhat unfairly for it, because Gandhi is not simply, we often think of him as an idealist who lived, somehow above our own, above the ground we all live on. But of course, the reverse is true. Gandhi takes everyday relations and problems very, very seriously. He thinks through them. And I think this is one way, these debates, these disputes that I brought up, in which we can see how he engages highly problematic and violent debates, disputes, and controversies so as to turn them around, so as to get to what he thinks is in fact, their real truth, that there has to be a truth in there somewhere, and he's going to find what that truth is. But that truth can only be revealed through nonviolence, and as he puts it, through silence. So if you impose silence, or if you recognize the silence that lies at the heart both of cow protection and of, as to a religious feeling and faith, then you have rescued the kernel of truth, which is by definition nonviolent, in those otherwise violent movements.
Okay, so I think Renu Parikh's is more of an appreciative comment rather than a question. It says, as an advocate and a trained mediator, this comes across as an absolutely fresh and a deep thought-provoking lesson. So she thanks the Asiatic Society and you. I have two questions, so I'll quickly, ask. I think it was a very fascinating talk where you showed how, rehearsed speech, as you say, and prefabricated narratives on one hand, and the power of silence and the individual, which Gandhi prioritizes. you gave us two examples from Hind Swaraj, one of which was of doctors. And the example you gave was of an individual who sort of loses control over his own body. Let's say if he, has a medicine by which power in a way is given to the colonial state of that time, and in effect to the pharmaceutical companies. But, if it was an individual who chose, to go for Ayurveda or Unani Tib, then how would one look at this? And going beyond that, at that time, in the context of epidemic diseases, vaccination, where there was a mediation of the colonial state, led to saving of lives of, so that is one. Second, I want to say that although the power of silence of Gandhi and why he advocates is, it's very clear from your talk. And the examples you also mentioned was that time and again through the satyagraha and the non-violent, the non-violence or the non-violent techniques that Gandhiji used during the different satyagrahas, through the nationalist movement, in a way, kept that ground, as you say, the space open for the other person, for the state and so on. But don't you think that communication, because was also a key, as in before undertaking any movement, even if it was through satyagraha, there is a dialogue, isn't it? I mean, so how would one reconcile that? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Manjari. Yes, for the first, of course, you're right that Gandhi was a great advocate of, if you will, alternative medicine, and his most popular work is actually called Key to Health.
Yes.
And it's about all these home remedies that he himself has tried out. He experiments constantly. So he's quite, it's not like he's against medicine altogether. But of course, what he's against in modern medicine is it's what he conceives as, for two things specifically. One, it's linked to the pharmaceuticals industry, state validation and capitalism. And two, its reliance on the vivisection of animals for experiments, because he thinks that's violent. So, medical procedures and pharmaceutical products that come about because of experimentation on animals and killing of animals, he really dislikes that. But that apart, he's obviously not against medicine. The example that he gives in Hind Swaraj is important, not because it's pro or anti-medicine, but because he's interested in the self-discipline of the individual. That if you don't actually require medicine, you shouldn't just become dependent on it. You should rather control your own appetite, so you don't need to take a tablet because you overeat. Instead of doing that, just don't overeat. So you must. So in a way, it's a kind of delicate balance between, on the one hand, the medication that he approves of, which is derived from nonviolent means, and that's not simply about making profits for companies. Even that approved of medicine, should not just be used as an aid to your own indulgence. So it shouldn't be self-indulgent. So that, if you will, is his critique. About communication, yes, of course. And as I said, even on his days of silence, he's writing notes and things like that. So he's always communicating. But sometimes silence is crucial because both in terms of self-suffering, like his fasting, but both, I have to go, I'm afraid I'm getting called, but let me finish up. Yeah. So both because of both because Satyagraha as self-sacrifice is, if you will, necessarily silent. It might be preceded by speech and writing. It might be followed by speech and writing. But in itself, it must be silent, whether it's the fasting body, whether it is putting yourself in line to be beaten by the police, whether it is lying down in front of a tram or something, all of those acts are silent in this sense. You have abandoned the act of persuasion through speech by literally putting your body in its place.
Okay, so thank you. On behalf of the Mumbai Research Center of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I thank you, Professor Faisal Devji, for this wonderful, thought-provoking talk on Gandhi's Silence This Republic Day. Thank you so much for giving us your valuable time, and we thank Professor Nalwala for organizing it, for inviting us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Nalwala. And thank you, Professor Devji, I'm afraid has to leave for another panel discussion. So thank you so much.
Yeah, can I
thank you very much.
Thank you, Manjari Alaporia, the president of the Asiatic Society. Professor Devji, really a very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Manjari. It was a pleasure to listen to both of you and hope to have you more often with us. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants for being there. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Professor Balaporia. Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Manjari.